So first I'm going to introduce Beverly. Please save any questions you may have for the end. You can go ahead and type them in the Q&A box, and then we'll get to them towards the end. So Beverly is the Director of National Initiatives with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. She has extensive experience building local partnerships to end homelessness and has held leadership roles in supportive housing development and service design, delivery, and coordination. So we're very happy to have Bev today, and I'm going to turn it over to Bev.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Good. I guess it is late afternoon or late morning for folks there. I'm in Detroit, Michigan, so it's about, I don't know, it's late afternoon here for us, 4:45. So super excited to be able to talk to you guys about the federal criteria and benchmarks today. An overview of kind of what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. I wanted to talk about the veteran criteria and benchmarks, how that plays into the work you're doing, how that works with grant and per diem coordination. Additionally, the master list and benchmark tool, and then have the opportunity to dig into some question and answer session for the participants as well. So a little bit about USICH for those of you who are not aware, but I think many of you hopefully are, because I know you guys have been looking at the criteria and benchmarks for some time. But USICH is charged with coordinating the federal response to homelessness, creating a national partnership at every level of government and with the private sector to reduce and end homelessness across the nation, and really trying to maximize the effectiveness of the federal government in contributing to the end of homelessness. And in that vein, really, when we coordinate the federal response at USICH, some of the big areas we work on are the actual council, the USICH Council, which is made up of 19 federal agencies, and then we have several other working groups, the Council Policy Working Group, which is career level staff that kind of discuss the policy piece to our work. And then interagency working groups. I actually just got off the phone from another conference call prior to this one with what is called our SVHO, Solving Veteran Homelessness as One, where we meet monthly with HUD and VA and other federal partners to discuss multiple efforts of our work in interagency coordination around ending homelessness for veterans. We also then, another big piece of our work is performance measurement and accountability. I would also be remiss in saying that I lead our national initiatives team, which is the team of folks that are based out in the field across the country. And it's our job to kind of learn what's happening in the field or hear feedback from all of you, bring it back to DC, and then what's happening in kind of DC and with the federal partners, bringing it back to the communities, states, and local partners. And I'm hoping all of you might know Katie Miller. She is the regional coordinator that covers Hawaii. So the other thing I wanted to share about that as well is having some different conversations with Katie Miller. I've had the opportunity to track some of the work across Hawaii through her, and she's consistently told me so much about how hard all of you have been working and partnering over the last several years, whether it be on the criteria and benchmarks, and I know you guys are also heavily involved with Built for Zero, and striving towards having an effective system to end veteran homelessness. So I think it's just really important to let you know that at the national level, we have been following your work, and we know how hard you're working. And particularly, I've been hearing some good things as well, that during this pandemic, that you guys are still continuing to push forward and just keep getting closer and closer every day. So I'll start with saying, I think all of us have seen this, but I think last fall, the administration announced that veteran homelessness had been cut in half since 50% since 2010. And so, again, this is something I think that's truly a testament to kind of that unwavering dedication of all of you who work, tirelessly every day and day in, day out across our country to show that, every veteran has a safe and stable place to call home. Our progress on veterans also, I just think, is a really major proof point for all of our work on homelessness, and that it really shows that when you have the right resources, such as HUD-VASH and SSVF, paired with the right strategies, and when we set kind of bold and ambitious goals, we're able to achieve them. So, and we have to work and do this all together. This is not just an issue that is for the Veterans Administration. It is an issue for all of our country and our federal partners. Another kind of big thing around the criteria and benchmarks is, to date, I actually did not update this slide, but I believe we have 80 communities and 3 states that have achieved ending veteran homelessness. We just approved another community last week. And this means that these communities, that they've demonstrated that they have a system in place ensuring that homelessness for veterans is rare, brief, and one time. I think what's been really exciting over the past, several weeks, we've been getting a lot more requests for communities to be confirmed around ending veteran homelessness. And communities have just, even though, we're all in the midst of this pandemic and trying to, make sure the resources are there and people are being served, that communities are still just pushing really hard on this. And so I'm excited that over the next several weeks, we'll be reviewing some additional communities. And those communities, again, like I said, they're striving and doing great things. Let's see. All right. So some historical info related to the federal criteria and benchmarks is that, the criteria and benchmarks have evolved over time based on what we've learned from different communities. And we began many years ago with just criteria, and then added benchmarks and specifications, then adjusted benchmark, what is called benchmark A, and now we've added some clarification around grant and per diem program models as well. I think, it was developed by all of the federal partners at USICH, VA, and HUD. I happen to lead that federal partner review team, and we do a significant amount of due diligence when we're working with communities that are interested in getting federal confirmation. I think it's always really important to share that in the second bullet, that it represents a minimum standard to achieve success within a defined period, but the goal is ongoing assessment and improvement even once confirmed. It's not like you put the brakes on once you've achieved the goal. I think what we have seen is communities continue to sustain their work and push even further. So for example, instead of making sure every veteran's housed within 90 days, some communities get it down to 24 days or 30 days, and it's a minimum standard that we've set. We've also noted that sometimes the criteria and benchmarks will be updated. Our most recent version was updated in June of 2019, and as we continue to review communities still this far into the game, we still do learn new things, and we take all of those things under consideration and advisement when we look as to whether we need to update them. So key updates for the most recent version in June were really that we consolidated information, specifications, and clarifications, just kind of to make it easier for a community to review and understand and have all of the information in one document instead of several documents. And then additionally, we provided clarification on the grant and per diem program models and how those programs and veterans staying within them are considered within the criteria in benchmarks. So I think it's just important to set that context as communities consider potentially submitting an application. So let's get into the meat of it and talk a little bit about the 5 criteria. There's 5 criteria in 4 benchmarks. And the first one is that the community has identified all veterans experiencing homelessness. I think it's important when we talk about identification of veterans experiencing homelessness, we're talking about how the community uses comprehensive data sources to ensure all veterans in the community are accounted for. This includes veterans who are unsheltered, as well as veterans in shelters, grant and per diem programs, other VA residential programs, such as potentially a domiciliary, and other VA and non-VA funded transitional housing. It also includes in-reach to veterans in shelters, transitional housing, or institutional settings. Many communities utilize a by name list, which includes data from the VA, HMIS, and non-HMIS participating providers. So that's something we really dig at. It looks different in all communities around how that by name list works and how they are mitigating some of the information from the different partners, but it is definitely a streamlined process and all the partners are engaged. The second criteria really is around the community providing shelter immediately to any veteran experiencing unsheltered homelessness who wants it. This has a lot to do also with shelter capacity. The community has the capacity to immediately offer low barrier shelter to any veteran who wants it. And I think by low barrier shelter, whoops, I'm sorry. I just lost my spot. 1 second. All right. By low barrier shelter, I think folks know this. It's really that, you're not making unnecessary requirements related to, minimum income, lack of a criminal record, or unnecessary conditions for someone to access the shelter. And I think, in some communities where we've seen this, or in rural communities, you have to look at other alternatives for low barrier shelter. In many communities, we'll use motel and hotel vouchers in that situation if there is limited shelter capacity in that community, and if they're not able to fully work with their local shelters to reduce the barriers. But again, we're always encouraging communities to work with their partners to reduce barriers to shelter so that anyone who wants to come in is able to. The third one is that the community provides service-intensive transitional housing in limited instances. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides, but really also, again, this has a lot to do with choice. The fourth is that the community has capacity to assist veterans to swiftly move into permanent housing. So this is where we ask communities to describe their capacity to offer permanent housing to every veteran identified as experiencing homelessness. And we actually use benchmark B to measure that, to look at how much time it takes as a whole for the community to move those veterans swiftly to permanent housing options. The fifth area is that the community has resources, plans, and system capacity in place should any veteran become homelessness or be at risk of homelessness in the future. So this is really about the sustainability as well, and that, again, that as the community is working towards these 5 criteria, that they have, the critical funding in place, they're able to you know, make sure that, you know, programs and plans are in place and that you're able to sustain this effort. So it's really important, again, once you develop this effective systems, that doesn't mean, again, that you stop what you're doing because you've, you know, achieved the goal. It means that you have to be able to make sure that you have the right leadership teams and plans and resources in place. I think something that we've learned over time, and we've seen in some communities who have had success, but then maybe had to, I guess, re-energize, I would say, is because they had kind of met the threshold and were there around the criteria. And then, you know, several months later or a year later, there were potentially leadership changes in the community and kind of so things slowed down. So those are some of the things that we actually look at when we're talking about sustainability, to make sure that the community has all of that in order, so that if there were some kind of breakdown or leadership change, that the community would continue on, and that it was not just kind of person or personality driven. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the four criteria, the four benchmarks. And the first is that they're benchmarks A through D, and they really provide a way for us to measure how well a community's response to veteran homelessness is working. And we look at those four benchmarks. First, we want to see that chronic and long-term veteran homelessness has been ended with few or rare exceptions, right? That number is expected to be as close to zero as possible. We do allow for a few exemptions, which I'll talk about in a moment. Benchmark B measures the average length of time from identification to permanent housing for all veterans during a 90-day period. Here we're checking whether the veterans have rapid access to permanent housing, and that's defined as 90 days or less on average, with a few rare exemptions that we will get into in a moment. Benchmark C looks at inflow and outflow to ensure sufficient permanent housing capacity, right? So we're looking at the number of veterans coming in the system on a monthly or a 90-day basis, and then the amount exiting, and that the amount exiting is greater than the inflow. Finally, benchmark D looks at the proportion of veterans entering service-intensive transitional housing relative to the total number of newly identified veterans, with the expectation that the percentage will be relatively low. So on this one, we are looking at, when a veteran is coming into the system, that they're not automatically always going into service-intensive transitional housing. So if you have, I'm just going to make up a number here, 25 new veterans entering your system, a red flag for the review team that they would dig much deeply into is if you had 20 veterans then entering service-intensive transitional housing. The review team would kind of dig into that, because it just seems like a high percentage of folks choosing that option, which potentially could be the case, but I think what we've seen historically is that the percentage is relatively low. So a little bit more about the service-intensive transitional housing is, that veterans who choose to enter any service-intensive transitional housing are provided with ongoing services to engage, to express a preference for or to request and to access a permanent housing intervention instead through an at least monthly review of their individualized services and housing plans and their desired outcomes for services and housing. Veterans who've been offered an available permanent housing intervention but have declined and instead chosen to enter a transitional housing program in order to address that particular clinical need are exempted from both benchmarks A and benchmarks B. So I think that's important to note. We certainly recognize that many veterans may choose that option and made those exemptions for that reason. And again, this was worked out through and in partnership with both HUD and the VA as far as the benchmarks go. Some other exempt categories related to benchmark A is that veterans in limited instances may be, like I said, exempt from some of those groups when we're looking at these calculations. And for benchmark A, which is long-term and chronic homelessness, we're looking at 3 groups of veterans. The first being any veteran experiencing chronic or long-term homelessness who has been identified and offered a permanent housing intervention, but who has not yet accepted. We certainly recognize that it takes time to engage and work with veterans. And we have had, an example of this, we've had, communities where there might be a particular veteran that they've been working with, for years and trying to engage, and that veteran may have just not accepted at that point. And so, again, intending for those to be rare exemptions. The second exemption is any veteran experiencing chronic or long-term homelessness who's been offered an available permanent housing intervention, but is declined and chosen to enter transitional housing program in order to appropriately address a clinical need. Again, valuing the veteran choice in their care. And the third group of to be exempted is any veteran that has accepted a permanent housing intervention, but is still actively in the process of identifying, securing, or moving into a unit. So what we've seen sometimes when people are calculating these benchmarks is that at that time they're really close, but they may have a veteran that's kind of in process of doing those things, either securing a unit, but they're close to moving in. So the review team often will ask and get into the weeds on those kinds of questions with communities. Next are some exemptions for benchmark B. What I can say in some of this as well, that we have a couple of handy charts, and then if you look at the actual documents that we have for the criteria and benchmarks, it's easier kind of to see in a chart. But for benchmark B, the exemptions are for group 1, for any veteran who was identified and offered a permanent housing intervention, but did not initially accept the offer. The calculation of the average should only include the time from when they accepted the intervention until when they moved into housing. So I think that, again, some of the communities, when they're looking at this is why the benchmark generation tool, which I'll talk a little bit about, has been really, really helpful to communities in calculating all of this data. The second exempted group from B is any veteran who's offered permanent housing intervention, but declined and chose service-intensive transitional housing, whether to address a clinical need or not. Prior to moving, permanent housing destination should not be included. Think that the offers must be documented through a transparent and coordinated system within the homelessness veteran service system, so that a refusal of a permanent housing intervention and the veteran's choice to enter service-intensive transitional housing is easily verifiable. And we push that again on the community as part of the process. We don't get into some of that super detailed information. So here is one of the charts that our partners with at the VA and USICH and HUD also worked on to kind of, all those exemptions I talked a lot about. If you're not in the weeds on some of this, it can be a little bit overwhelming. But this little chart here is really a summary of the exempted groups that veterans in transitional housing may fall under within benchmarks A and B. But I do want to note there are no exemptions when you're calculating benchmarks C and D. But this chart, I think, makes it a little bit more helpful for folks. All right, I'm going to talk just a little bit about some GPD considerations in relation to the criteria and benchmarks that I think are important as you guys are doing this work as a community. And I think, these are things oftentimes that almost all of you, given the work that you guys have been doing there, I think are pushing towards or doing. And that is making sure that you're offering veteran-centric services based on choice and needs. I think that, that's such a critical component to all of this is, respecting and providing services that are based on the veteran's choice. We also think that it's really important that you're offering all veterans an appropriate permanent housing intervention prior to grant and per diem referral and enrollment, so they know that what options are available to them. Also, we think, it's critical to be discussing permanent housing plans with veterans while they're in grant and per diem programs, so that they are also planning for options after a successful stay in grant and per diem. Also engaging with the community to use a master list and case conferencing that expedites housing opportunities by ensuring communication and coordination. I think this is one thing that is just so important in having the right partners around the table. And we've seen communities just kind of transform when they are working a by name list or a master list and doing that case conferencing. It just really pushes the community forward in ways and provides great access and opportunities for the veterans as well. Finally, using lower barriers to entry and providing case management that results in termination only in the most extreme cases. I think, again, low barriers and that case management and a harm reduction approach are really critical in helping veterans succeed. I want to talk briefly about, just point you guys to a document that came out from the Veterans Administration. It's the Transformation of the VA Grant and Per Diem Programs and Considerations for Communities, which was also released at the end of June. And it was a joint venture between the VA Homeless Programs Office, the Grant and Per Diem National Program Office, and USICH. And we're hoping that this document, continues to be shared widely. Hopefully some of you have seen it, but I'd like to bring it up and reference it, because the brief is a wonderful tool in helping us to develop some common and shared language within communities. So again, this document also has some wonderful charts and about what the models look like nationally and across different VISNs or veteran integrated service networks. So it's just, I think it's a good document for folks in the community to be aware of and to look at as we, the Grant and Per Diem program has continued to transform with the different models. All right. I wanted to also flag for folks the Master List and Benchmark Report Generation Tool, version 3. The newest reversion was released on both the HUD Exchange and SSVF University. Those were posted, actually, I think maybe in January or February, we finally got those up there. But there were some changes to some of the benchmark specifications, required updates to kind of that report and programming. One of the challenges with the newer version was that the users have to migrate data from the previous versions of the tool. There's some explicit instructions on there, but I think that there's also opportunities, if that's something that you guys are working on, that technical assistance can also help. We have been trying to put together a webinar demonstrating the tool and how to migrate that data as well. So I can flag just for folks what's new in the benchmark and generation tool. Again, this is an optional tool. It's just meant to be an aid to communities in calculating the benchmarks and criteria and looking at your system. But the big thing really is that we added all of the transitional housing models from bridge housing, low demand, hospital to housing, clinical treatment, service intensive, non-VA bridge housing, and non-VA service intensive transitional housing. And some people who are much savvier than I were able to program that and use the different logic to make sure that the tool is working properly. One of the last things I want to talk about before we open it up to some questions and answers, I'd like to just have a bunch of time to see how I can support you guys and answer any of your questions. But I think, again, as I talked about at the very beginning of the session, is that, you know, sustainability is really, really important. You know, we want to stress that achieving the criteria and benchmarks also means that communities are able to sustain their progress long into the future. As I mentioned earlier, this is about helping individual veterans stabilize in housing so that they are never homeless again, and ensuring that there's that adequate level of resources to respond to future needs. I think that that's so important. This also means institutionalizing some processes and procedures so that even changes in leadership and staff, as I mentioned earlier, the work will continue without interruption. That's why some of the, you know, the processes and protocols and some of that bureaucratic stuff is important so that it can move on into the future. We did release a document last November that talked about 10 strategies to sustaining an end to veteran homelessness, you know, which I will share this PowerPoint with all of the links for everyone. But again, I think, you know, thinking about some of these things that I know you guys are already doing right now in Hawaii, you have a core leadership team that's engaged with the service networks. You know, you're really committed to that, using data and benchmarks to monitor your system effectiveness, integrating this collaboration into COC governance and coordinated entry processes, you know, planning shared trainings and clear communication protocols, integrating that master list or binding list and case conferencing into the operations. I think, you know, another thing on that is, you know, like I said, the Veterans Administration, this is not something they can do alone. They need the help of federal partners. They need the help of state partners and local partners. It actually can't, excuse me, be done without those partners. So again, just want to applaud the local VA and the local leaders at the state and in the different communities for continuing to lift this work up. It's hard work, and you have to keep pushing forward. You know, I think the last thing too, and I know you guys have some challenges there with, you know, the cost of the housing market and affordability, and again, that it's really important to continue to recruit housing partners and landlords and manage open unit portfolios and to keep those relations going into the future. Even if you get your list down, whether you're going for the criteria and benchmarks, those are ongoing relationships that need to be cultivated. You know, there needs to be dedication to those activities. My last slide, finally, before we kind of get into some Q&A for us today, is just really it's a list of all of the tools and information that you can have at your fingertips, from the criteria and benchmarks themselves to the master list, the GPD program, transformation of VA GPD programs, the sustaining document. We also have some wonderful case studies of communities that have achieved the goal. Many of you may be very familiar with the Mayor's Challenge to End Veteran Homelessness, which I'm still continuing to lead that work, and we actually still have mayors signing on, not as frequently as we used to be, but we do have regular communication with our mayors across the country to help them continue to use their voice in the community to make sure that every veteran has a home. I think hopefully folks are very familiar with the SSVF program webpage and SSVF University. SSVF continues every day as part of VA programs to innovate and do wonderful things with their program, flexibilities, waivers, particularly also during COVID. And so encourage you to look at that. And then the last two other documents, the GPD program webpage and Homelessness in America, which is a document we published that specifically looks at some of the data, some of the national data, the progress and challenges we have. Like I said, we've made tremendous progress on our work on veterans. I think it's a proof point. It's the proudest piece of my work at USICH, but we still have a tremendous amount of work to do. With that, I'm going to pause there. I know I talked a lot, and see Lindsay if we have any questions, and I hope I can answer them.
Thanks so much, Bev. That was great. That kind of stuff gets me really excited. Does anybody have any questions? To just enter it in the question and answer box, and Bev will do her best to answer your questions. Minutes here. No question?
I was that thorough? Come on, I can't believe
You did great. Well, if there aren't any questions, in the chat box is the link to go back to the main session where we'll have our closing plenary. I just wanted to thank Bev so much for joining us and leading us in this conversation. And thank you to everyone who participated. Much appreciated. See you guys all later.
Bye, guys. Thank you.